Christmas in the Highlands. Christmas 2012 for me and my family was to be spent in an isolated cottage on the shores of a sea loch called Loch Sunat on the isolated Ardnamurchan Peninsula, not too far from Fort William in the West Highlands of Scotland. The Highlands of Scotland, especially in the west, is where the most dramatic scenery is found, with roaring, tumbling burns, lochs, miles of desolate moorland, and towering mountains, usually with snow-covered peaks in winter as far as you can see. The density of birds and animals is relatively low, but those that are here are generally to be savoured and well worth the time, patience and effort it takes to find them. All this with very few people around, so when you find something, it is a very personal affair, and the memory becomes just as permanent as the timeless contours of the ever-present mountains. I do not intend to go into a day-by-day account, but just concentrate on one particular highlight of this holiday, and boy was I in for a pleasant surprise. The weather throughout was, as expected, grim, with rain on all but one day, but this is the west of Scotland, and it always rains in winter. Athleat Cottage was, however, roomy and yet cosy, with a huge kitchen, and pulling up a deep and cosy armchair by the fire in the living room, I settled down with a whisky, and we were all set for Christmas, apart from one required trip into Fort William to collect a joint of beef and a brace of pheasants ordered earlier by my wife from the local butcher. The less said about a grey and unprepossessing Fort William, the better. The only thing in its favour at this time of year was the towering presence of a snow-covered Ben Nevis above it, quite magnificent, with other huge mountains disappearing into the distance behind it. The day after our arrival at Athleat Cottage, I decided to take a short drive around the head of Loch Sunat to Strontian, on the opposite side of the loch to our cottage, and where the element strontium, named after the town, was discovered. A pleasant surprise greeted me immediately on leaving the cottage, with a flock of around 60 siskins feeding in the alders by the loch side. The single-track road faithfully follows the contours of the loch, very close to the shore, all the way round, and is ideal for using the car to look for otters. I was out of luck today and eventually arrived in Strontian and parked by a small area of salt marsh to look at some grey-legged geese. Yes, real wild ones, none of your farm or reservoir southern softy ferals here. There were also some curlew and oyster catchers fiddling about on the marsh, the only resident waders at this time of year. Whilst looking at them, I became aware of 4 mallard emerging from under a bank and dabbling in the flooded vegetation. A casual glance. Well, they're only mallard. One looked darker than the rest. I looked closer in my bins. For a moment I was flummoxed. What was it? A hybrid, surely. Mallards are notorious for this, after all. Drake Gadwell? No. Then suddenly it registered. I had seen this duck in North America. It was an American black duck, and a drake, what's more. It was paired to a regular female mallard, and quite happily feeding and coming ever closer on the incoming tide. I did not shout expletives. I was not, in the popular parlance, stunned, nor started shaking, but quietly did a mental jig of joy and called my wife to share my excitement. I took images as fast as I could with the camera. I was fully aware of the pitfalls and problems relating to hybridization of this species, with the very closely related mallard, but with no reference books or articles to help me, just took as many images from as many angles as possible and made copious notes, all to be consulted later. I knew the pattern and colour of the speculum was an important feature. I waited for almost 2 hours, which frankly was no hardship with such a rare bird in front of me, until it finally gave up feeding and started to preen, and I at last got to see the crucial speculum. Blue, with no white on the leading edge, and only the thinnest of white lines on the trailing edge. It looked good, very good, to be the real thing, but I was still cautious. Now, of course, it was too dark to get an image of the speculum for future reference. Never mind. My day closed with the black duck asleep and darkness descending at only 4 in the afternoon. Well, this is Scotland. I returned to the cottage, and after another large whisky and a long discussion with Angus at Birdline Scotland, we agreed it was a genuine pure black duck, and he would put the news out on Birdline Scotland. This was a real result. Christmas had come 2 days early for me. My record was accepted by the British Birds Rarities Committee and turned out to be the 39th for the UK. I also noticed that one of the other 3 mallards with it was a male mallard black duck hybrid, also paired to a female mallard. So presumably the black duck had been here for quite some time and had bred successfully with a female mallard. What a great start to the holiday. The next day was Christmas Eve, and I made the same drive around the loch, again looking for otters, and approaching Strontian found 2 otters playing with a fish. It looked like they were mother and a full-grown cub. Of course, they were in the most difficult place to park a car on a single-track road, but eventually I found a passing place in which to leave the car, sneaked out with the camera and got some pictures as they came out of the water and messed about on some seaweed-covered rocks. Then back into the water they went and out into the middle of the loch, fishing and playing. I moved on to try and see the black duck again, but there was no sign of it or of any mallards. In fact, I only subsequently saw it once more on the day before we left, so my initial sighting was really lucky. Happy Christmas and New Year to everyone. Slán Siobhar.